Almighty God, humbly acknowledging our need for thy guidance in all things, and laying aside all private and personal interests, we beseech thee to grant that we may conduct the affairs of this house and of our country to the glory of thy holy name, the maintenance of true religion and justice, the honour of the Queen, and the public welfare, peace and tranquillity of New Zealand, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. No petitions have been delivered to the Clerk for presentation. Ministers have, however, delivered papers.
Government response to the report of the Social Services Committee on its inquiry into the identification, rehabilitation and care and protection of child offenders.
I hereby present the annual reports of the Parliamentary Service Commission for the year ended 30 June 2012. Those papers are published under the authority of the House. No select committee reports have been delivered to the Clerk for presentation and no bills have been introduced, so the House comes to questions. I'll point of order the Honourable Trevor Mallard.
Mr Speaker, before we get to questions, I want to raise with you a point of order which goes to Speaker's Rulings 151.2, 5 and 6, and to your ruling on the 22nd of May, which has not yet made it to the Green Book, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, you have given two opposition members in particular some good advice over a period of time regarding making questions specific and clear if we expect ministers to be prepared to answer them. This morning, the Labour opposition lodged a question to the Prime Minister which asked whether he stood by his statements that he and his ministers had made in relation to the reading recovery question. That is, whether the Prime Minister stands by his statement. That, sir, goes to what is in the Prime Minister's mind and his opinion. Mr Speaker, 151.2 does make it clear that there's an ability to transfer, as we all know. But, Mr Speaker, I raised with you, through your office, the question of whether 151.5 might apply in this case as to whether it was possible for another minister to indicate what was in the Prime Minister's mind and who has responsibility for that. I will get back to that point in a second, sir. The next draft of the question, which came back from the government, asked, it was a proposal to shift it to the Minister of Education, which asked, does she stand by her statements and those of the Prime Minister? Now that, sir, was clearly a very different question. It's not a question about whether the Prime Minister stood by his statements. It's a question as to whether that Minister stood by hers and agreed with the Prime Minister. Quite different. And of course I think we would all accept that no junior minister could be responsible for what's in the Prime Minister's mind. Mr Speaker, it then moved along to whether she'd been informed whether the Prime Minister stands by his statements in relation to this, and that is the question which appears on the order paper. The point that I'd like to take you back to, sir, is your ruling on the 22nd of May, where I think you gave some very good advice, I think to Dr Norman on that particular occasion, when you said, in the case of the question to the Prime Minister, had the member simply asked the Prime Minister whether he stood by his statement with regard to asset sales, etc., and then stopped the question, then the member's point would have had merit. Mr Speaker, we took your advice on from that. We didn't ask about ministry advice, we didn't ask about any other related matters, and submitted a question in that format because we thought that at that point it would not be possible. It's a direct question, so obviously, it's a matter of public knowledge that the Prime Minister is not here, but we have an acting Prime Minister, and it is our view that it becomes a farce if this Parliament, if members of this Parliament cannot ask the Prime Minister whether he stands by his statements made about a particular issue in the very recent past. That's why I indicated to the Clerk's office for you that I thought that this could well be a case for 151.5 because we are getting to the point where it becomes almost impossible to hold the government to account, to hold the Prime Minister to account for what he says if in fact questions are transferred in this way. It is, you know, I can accept in a lot of areas it can be appropriate to transfer them. But my submission to you, sir, is that it is not possible for any other minister to be responsible for what's in the Prime Minister's mind, and therefore this goes to the type of question for which transfer should not be allowed.
The Honourable Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, I think two things are relevant here. Firstly, the question was to do with reading recovery and comments by other ministers as well. Second point would be that we do not abuse the process, and I reject completely the suggestion by the Shadow Leader of the House that we do. By transferring the question to the Minister for Education, particularly on a day when it's plain and evident to everybody that the Prime Minister himself is not in the country, let alone in the House, would have given a better opportunity for clearly the information that the opposition wanted around reading recovery to be properly discussed. Questions never stop with just the question, do you stand by all your statements? Yes, I do. End of the question. They don't. They carry on through the supplementary process where further information is sought, presumably and usually about the issue that's identified as part of that question. So in transferring the question to the Minister, we were simply wanting to create an opportunity for more information to be more authoritatively given to the House. But what I would say also, sir, though, is that the question that now appears on the order paper I think is a little on the tough side. I don't know, I can see now how we got to this because both parties would appear to be somewhat unhappy about the question. But I think rather than going into the merits of the question, how we got there, I would like to just leave my contribution strongly at we are not trying to frustrate the process at all. You have been very, very strong over the past few years, in fact, the last 4 years, in requiring ministers to answer questions and to provide information to the House. You've pulled many of us up, including me, for not giving enough information at times. So that is a consideration that we always have in mind when we look at whether or not a question should be transferred. But in this circumstance, Mr Mallard's own comments that no other minister could know what was on the mind of the Prime Minister, it seems somewhat ridiculous to be suggesting that the transfer was inappropriate, when in fact the information itself could never be directly solicited.
I'll hear very briefly further from
very briefly, Mr.
Honourable
Because
Shadow.
there are 2 points. The first is that it is well established in Speaker's rulings that the absence of a minister is not the reason for the transfer. It is a matter of responsibility, not presence. And therefore, I think part of the response from the Leader of the House fails. But, sir, if it was a matter of having a minister who might be more informed than the person currently acting for the Prime Minister in responding to the question, but keeping the question the same, it is always an option for the government to have, in the absence of the Prime Minister, another minister actually answer on his behalf. And that might have been a logical and fair thing to do.
I've allowed this point of order to take some time because I think it is a serious issue for the House. I think the Honourable Trevor Mallard has raised an interesting dilemma for the House during question time. The fact that New Zealand does not have a question time, a Prime Minister's question time, makes our question time a little different from, say, the British Parliament. And the dilemma that we all face in this is, and I think the Honourable Leader of the House referred to this in his response to the point of order, is that where a question is seen, does the Prime Minister stand by statements and other ministers' statements, say, in relation to a specific issue, If the government is assuming that that issue is of the main interest to the questioner, the risk is if it stays with the Prime Minister in answering will say, well, the member should put down a question to the relevant minister. And that's why I think the government is not trying to, it's my understanding, not trying to escape accountability in trying to make sure the substance of the issue can best be covered by the relevant minister. But I accept that it may not be that way. The questioner may in fact wish to be pursuing something very much specific to the Prime Minister's statement, but that won't automatically be obvious from the question. That's the dilemma. The government is absolutely entitled to transfer a question unless it would be anathema to accountability for that to be the case. And the members raised that point, and I agree with him that were the Prime Minister to be the only person who could possibly have information on a certain issue, then it should not be transferred. Where an opinion is being sought, it's not quite of the same, the bar is not quite at the same level, I would suggest, because an opinion is never quite as an important accountability issue as where the Prime Minister is being questioned on whether or not something happened. And if the Prime Minister is the only person who could possibly know that, then it would be contrary to accountability in this House for such a question to be transferred. We're in something of a dilemma. As Speaker, I'm in something of a dilemma in handling these. I absolutely support the government's right to transfer questions. What I'd like to suggest for the longer term, perhaps, is that the Standing Orders Committee gives some thought to whether or not this House would like to set aside any time during a parliamentary session for questions to the Prime Minister. Other parliaments do have them. It may get over this problem. It's something that I'd leave in members' minds because I can't see us easily resolving the issue with our current standing orders because the Speaker can't possibly know the intention of the questioner when they put the question down, whether they intend to go into the substance of a matter or to stick just with the opinion as to whether the Prime Minister stands by any statements. And opinions certainly are not matters that would prevent a question being transferred. There's no way that we should allow the House to, in my view, to set a standard that a question can't be transferred just when opinion is being sought. Point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, I just want to raise with you just two issues. The first is just to touch on the last point that you made, which is I think it's unreasonable for the government to transfer a question based on where they think the opposition are likely to be going with a question rather than where the primary question itself goes. The primary question in this case was quite specific to the Prime Minister's comments on a particular issue. And it's a point of order, are you?
Order.
And so the issue that we have, Mr Speaker, is I think the public quite rightly expect the Leader of the Opposition to be asking the Prime Minister questions about his comments on a whole range of issues. And where the Prime Minister refuses to answer those, or by transferring it to another member, the public rightly will think the Parliament is becoming a farce. It is not unreasonable to expect that the Prime Minister will be answering questions about the comments that he has made in public from the Leader of the Opposition.
I hear what the member is saying, but the obvious problem in the argument being put forward is that as soon as one assumes that actually members are interested in the substance of the issues, one assumes that, and as soon as the questioner gets into the substance of the issue, the Prime Minister has absolute liberty to say, well, the member should put down a question to the relevant minister. And that's happened, and it's caused points of orders to be raised in recent weeks on that very issue because it was alleged the Prime Minister had not answered the question. But the Prime Minister is absolutely at liberty to make the point that if members want detailed information on a particular issue, the question should be referred to that minister. Now, the government is absolutely entitled to transfer questions unless the Prime Minister could be the only person or the minister whom the question is addressed could be the only person who could possibly have information of significance. And opinions about whether people stand by certain statements are hardly matters that reach that test, in my view. It's only in recent years questions have been allowed to cover opinions. And I'm not about to see the bar raised on opinions to where questions that seek opinions can't be transferred. That disallowing the transferal of a question must be restricted only to issues of real significance where the Minister or Prime Minister whom the question is being addressed can be the only person who could possibly have that information. And I think that's... I've left it of the Honourable John Banks.
Mr Speaker, I wonder if I can make an observation about these matters, because I was here when Phil Goff was here in 1981, and I know that over recent years these standing orders and procedural matters around question time have been changed.
Order, it's a point of order.
The point I make is this: question time in this House is now for interested observers like myself and the public that sit here every day listening is a shambles. It does the Parliament no good. I suggest...
Order. No, it's not a point of order this is not a point of order to go down that track. The House, I think, should now come to questions for oral answer. And question number 1 stands in the Leader of the Opposition, name of the Leader of the Opposition, David Shearer.
Point of order.